You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you in further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean pulls you to enter into deeper waters.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And I hope you got a great show lined up for you today. It's certainly an interesting topic, and frankly it's one we don't hear talked about too much, which is a shame because it really is interesting and it really is important. And that's going to be, did society begin with monotheism, as it were? When we look back at what our most primitive ancestors believed, were they monotheists? And my guest can tell me if I phrase that terribly or not, but my guest is Dr. Winfried Corduan. He was born in 1949 in Hamburg, Germany, and in 1963 he moved to the U.S. In 1970 he got a B.S. in zoology at the University of Maryland. He went on to earn a master's in philosophy of religion at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and got a Ph.D. in religious studies at Rice Universities. From 1977 to 2008, he was a professor of philosophy and religion at Taylor University, and he retired on disability in 2008 as Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Religion. He is a writer of books like Neighboring Faiths, No Doubt About It, and the one we're talking about today, In the Beginning, God. And he and I have actually worked together at one apologetics conference at least. So, Dr. Corduan, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Hi, Nick. It's really good to be here. Please call me Win. Everybody does, and that makes it a little bit less formal. And you phrased the question pretty well. We don't like to use the word primitive these days to refer to people who don't have the same sophistication of technology as we do. But in order to talk about the topic, you have to refer to 19th century sources rather, and there the word primitive is being used all the time, as well as words that we definitely want to avoid, like savages.
Oh, yes.
or barbarians, or whatever. But the question that I talk about in that book is basically, were the first humans believers in one single God who created the universe and has certain expectations of human beings, or did religion begin along with other cultural developments, first with belief in magic and spirits and ghosts, and then from there going to gods and deities and a hierarchy of gods, and finally one God achieved the status of being the big one God? And my answer is, of course, of those two, that I believe there is good evidence that religion began with belief in a single God and worship of Him alone.
Well, Dr. Corduan, at this point, though, before we really get into the book, just in case if people might not know who you are, could you tell us a little bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing, and maybe in particular how you got into this field of what the original men believe, because it really isn't one we hear talked about a lot.
Well, it isn't for a number of reasons, but I got intrigued by it first when I was still in Germany. I was born in Hamburg, Germany. I was 13 years old when we came over to the United States. And in Germany at the time, they still had religion as a subject in the high schools, gymnasium. And we were divided into Protestant and Catholic in my class. And one day the Protestant teacher was absent, and we had the Catholic teacher. And I was sitting there as a little Baptist in a world that was mostly either Catholic or Lutheran, having my defenses ready, And he started to talk about these people who lived in the jungle and in the desert and so forth. And people have visited them, and at first you think they only worship spirits or they don't have any religion at all. But if you really get to know them, you find out that they actually believe in God, in a single God. And that I found that just totally intriguing. And then when I was in college, I read a book by Robert Brow about the origin of religion and the nature of religion, and he made reference to that phenomenon as well. So, it was something that I was carrying in my mind, that I was intrigued by, but really didn't have anything specific to go on. And I really did not get really into depth on that until I began to study world religions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you have to understand that right through my PhD, I was really not all that interested in world religions. Now, I had to take some courses in that subject at Rice, but my dissertation was on Hegel and Karl Rahner, the 20th century Jesuit theologian. So that's the way that I was thinking I was pointed. And that's the subject matter that I pursued, the intersection of religion and theology with philosophy. But when it came to finding a job at Taylor University, I had a somewhat awkward job description. My teaching was supposed to include the courses like New Testament survey, various philosophy courses like history and philosophy and logic, and world religions. And I had never thought that I would teach world religions. But that was my weakest course in terms of knowing the subject matter, so that's the course that I wound up putting the most effort into, bringing up to par. And I realized that I was getting along pretty well, and the Lord was using what I was learning. And so I began to focus on that subject more and more until it really became my specialty, as it were. I learned some Arabic, some Sanskrit. I was privileged to take a lot of trips to visit various places with the indigenous religions. And lo and behold, you could not really get through that subject matter without also smashing up against the question of how did religion originate? I mean, very few people nowadays, very few academics would actually defend a theory of evolution for religion, but almost all of them assume it. Mm-hmm. They just think, that's just a given, that monotheism could not possibly have been the beginning point. So I studied more and started to read Wilhelm Schmidt, the German scholar who wrote academically in defense of the biblical view, namely that everything started with God. Mm-hmm. And I realized that not only did he have some good reasons for what he was advocating, but those reasons were virtually ignored by most people, and even people who tried to follow him and accepted what his conclusions weren't necessarily following his argument, his specific line of argumentation, the method that he used, and consequently their argument was not as powerful as it could be. Mm-hmm. So this whole business is part of my development as a scholar, going where I never thought I would go.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I made reference to original monotheism in several of my earlier writings. And then an editor at Broad and Holman asked me if I wouldn't want to write a whole book about it. Now, you would have thought that I would have jumped at the chance immediately, but I really had to think about that for a minute, because I realized if I really wanted to do an in-depth work on that topic, I had to retool, as it were, because I had to not only speak from a philosophical point of view and the history of religions, I had to deal with anthropology and ethnography and those fields, and so I really had to do a lot more study if I wanted to write a whole book on it. And well, in the end I did, and I must say, if it wasn't for Google Books and some other research tools, I could not have brought it off. As it stands, we now have access to journals that 20 years ago I would not have had a prayer of finding anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The Proceedings of the Anthropological Society in London. I'm quite sure they don't have that in Alexandria Public Library.
Mm.
I wouldn't know. Maybe they would have it in Indiana University, 3 hours from here, or at U of M, Michigan, in Ann Arbor, 4.5 hours from here. But I wouldn't even know that. But thanks to the internet and all the resources that we have, research really became accessible.
Right.
And I want to tie that little piece of information to asking other folks who are interested to go and look up those journals. The information is there, and we can go on from what little I may have contributed to really exploring the subject matter again and looking at the interpretations that people gave to various discoveries, whether they're right or not.
Well, I wanted to say before we also got into that whenever I do a write-up for a show on Thursday, that's coming up on Saturday, I go and I post it online, and I was very surprised, I'm sure you'll be honored and humbled to hear so many people are so excited about this interview, and so many of them had heard about your book, or they had read it, or were getting ready to read it. And I remember one person who shared it was someone who has been on the show before, one of your former students, Marcia Montenegro, and she spoke very highly of you, so you have a lot of fans out there.
Well, thank you. It really is humbling, Nick. I have to tell you, I get emails from time to time from people that I have never met saying, I just read your, say, my apologetics textbook, no doubt about it, or whatever. Saying, the Lord has really used it in my life. And, even just as I'm talking about that here, I'm sitting here, I'm getting goosebumps.
Oh, yeah.
It's just so weird and so exciting to be making that kind of contribution. And for me, at least, that feeling has never gone away, and I trust it never will.
One thing my current pastor told me to do, and I've started doing it, he said, is keep a folder on your computer of cards and like encouragement. And when you get a good email or a message on Facebook or something like that, put it in that folder. And later on, when you're discouraged about things, go look in that folder and think back about the difference you got to make for the kingdom. And it really is incredible to do that.
Great, yeah. And by the way, I assume you're keeping a good archive of your blog, because that's going to be valuable for a long time to come.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate that. Let's go ahead.
I was just going to say, what people are going to be interested in 100 years from now is not what academicians repeated when they were citing people who said the same thing 50 years ago, but it's what people who were on some kind of cutting edge said. Some, people who made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
People who faithfully, say, kept a blog or went out on a limb with their writings, coming up with new ideas, were creative without violating orthodoxy. And so, yeah, I think, as always, the history of the early 21st century will look very different 100 years from now than it does to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, when we're looking at this topic here, when we talk about original monotheism, and let's clarify what the term means. I mean, from a Christian perspective, we don't mean these people were teaching the Trinity right from the start, and also we don't mean something like these people would have understood Aquinas' Summa Theologica and had a deep theology of God being omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, etc., etc. And what do we mean by saying original monotheism?
Okay, let me talk a little didactically here and number my statements, as it were. Number one, we are assuming an origin of human beings, a single, one-time origin of human beings. Now, as Christians, or if we were Muslims, we would believe that occurred at the time when God created people. But even if we don't have any particular religious convictions, nowadays a consensus is swelling in anthropology that human beings, that is, Homo sapiens, did not evolve from Neanderthal, and that they had a single place of origin somewhere in or around Africa, and there doesn't seem to be any direct connection to any of the other fossilized remains of the so-called pre-human hominids or anthropoids and so on. So regardless of where you come from, there's one point of origin. Let me just clarify here, this is not something that anthropologists have held for a long time. Back during the time when Wilhelm Schmidt worked, the idea was still that human beings, Homo sapiens, evolved separately in different parts of the world from different pre-human ancestors. And biologically, I find that highly questionable, but that's not the norm anymore. So then the question is, when Homo sapiens came into being, did they originally have a religion? And if so, what power did they worship, venerate, revere, and so forth? What was at the core of whatever we want to call their religion? Okay, now, by monotheism, we mean that these people, the original humans, recognized that there was only one God, as opposed to spirits and magic forces and so forth, and we can get into that later. But they recognized that there was one God, and this one God they worshipped. And then other developments in religion were incidents of decay from that original monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did they come to believe in that God? Well, we can say, of course, that God revealed himself, but we don't want to make that a premise,
Right.
because that would not be shared, even though Wilhelm Schmidt wound up making it a conclusion on the basis of the anthropological evidence, but we can save that for later. The basic thing is to recognize that belief in God is not this high and lofty and complex system that only someone with a Harvard education in the 19th century would have been able to arrive at, but it is the absolutely simplest form of belief. You look around and see the world, and you ask, who made this? And a child of 3 or 4 can already ask that. Now, I'm not saying that our earliest forebears had no more understanding or intelligence than a child of 3 or 4, but the belief in God does not actually rest on profound premises. Somebody must have made this. Somebody must have made the world, and even though they would not phrase their awareness in the way that St. Thomas Aquinas would, actually, in many ways, it is the cosmological argument. And they did conclude that the God who made the world must have been eternal. He couldn't have made himself. That doesn't make any sense. So he must have always existed and will always exist. They did believe that he knew everything and knew people's thoughts. They did believe that he was everywhere. They did associate him with ethical expectations. That is, fidelity in marriage, telling the truth, not killing needlessly.
10 Commandments type stuff.
Yeah, more or less. So, yeah, it's... now, we need to talk about the evidence for all of that, of course, but that's the conclusion, and that's what we mean by original monotheism. It's really not just an intuition that, well, somehow, somewhere, something must be God, or the idea that there is a hidden God beyond the sky, or that people first worshiped the sky and then they said the sky was God, but that they began with the very reasonable inference that looking at life and their experience of the world, there must have been a God who created it.
Well, before we get into the evidence, I would like to clarify that a little bit more. In fact, when we say they believed in one God, that doesn't mean they believed God was the only spirit being, as it were, because Christians, Jews, and Muslims would all identify as monotheists today, and yet they believe in creatures like angels, and Muslims call them jinn, I believe. So, I mean, that we're not saying that they believe God was the only spiritual being. There could have been lesser spiritual beings around, right?
That is absolutely correct, yeah. And, you know, I can think of some cultures where one could almost go either way and say, well, we could call them monotheists, but maybe not. I mean, for Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, you know, there's no question but that they are monotheists. And we recognize that, as you say, that they are other spirits, but we don't worship them. And we know that they are just creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are other cultures where it's very clear that these folks basically focus on spirits,
Mm-hmm.
ancestor spirits, nature spirits, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But many of them also believe in a creator God.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens that they do not pay much attention to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so a really good example is the Kikuyu of Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
Kikuyu are a dominant tribe in Kenya, they're agricultural, and they basically, on a day-to-day basis, venerate the spirits, particular ancestor spirits. And they may go for months, even years, without paying all that much attention to a high god who's called Ngai.
Mm-hmm.
But during a period of distress, if there's a drought or an epidemic or something like that, then the entire village may assemble under a specially designated holy tree, and they will together call on Ngai. Okay, and when I say the whole community, that includes the living people as well as the living dead, the so-called ancestors, and they're all there calling on Ngai to help. And when the outcome has been settled, then they don't pay much attention to Ngai any longer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would not call that culture really monotheistic,
Mm-hmm.
but some other people do. And some people say, well, they're monotheists but aren't aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that a little peculiar. But so, you're right. Monotheism does not exclude by any means the reality of other spiritual beings that are creatures of
Mm-hmm.
the one God. But it does mean that the one God is the one who is being worshipped, and the spirits and ghosts and so forth are not given that kind of consideration.
You know, when you were talking about this tribe where they live their lives, they don't think much about the one supreme God, and then when a drought or some sort of disaster comes, all of a sudden they remember him. I was just hearing this and I was thinking, gosh, it's a good thing we're beyond those kinds of days, and we don't have people anymore who know there is one supreme God and only acknowledge him when they really need some help from something. I mean, it's so good we're past that, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Yes, you're always at your best when you sneak in a little bit of sarcasm.
Mm-hmm. Now,
yeah, you know, most,
mm-hmm.
or let's say, I don't want to say most, no. But many people live as practical atheists,
Mm-hmm.
and then are monotheists only for pragmatic reasons.
Mm-hmm. We call it more therapeutic deism today.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we're talking about the evidence for this, I can hear some people out there would probably be pretty skeptical, and we'll say, you know, when we're studying something like the historical Jesus, which is my main area, we're looking at documents that come from about 2,000 years ago, and it's hard enough to piece together what the people believed back then. But we're supposed to piece together what people believed thousands or 10,000s or maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago without any documents. I mean, they didn't write things down back then. How are we supposed to get at what they really believed?
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this, and then I'll drop it and get into the actual subject matter. You open a drawer in your kitchen and you find 2 forks there.
Mm-hmm.
One is bright and shiny. The other one the tine are straight and rusted, and there's a handle on that fork which is wobbling.
Mm-hmm.
And are you going to have a hard time deciding which one is the older one?
No.
Even though they don't come with written certificates.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so, you know, I want to say it's not rocket science. The method by itself, it really is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be willing to follow the method.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to take several steps back in time and go back to Tyler,
Mm-hmm.
who was the leading advocate of the evolution of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a master of details. And he compiled information about different cultures from all over the world. And he saw a lot of animism, there's belief in spirits and veneration of spirits, and he associated those particularly with cultures that were materially and in other aspects not very well developed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, I think, without committing ourselves to a theory of the evolution of human culture, would all agree that we have made some kind of a change, and we may or may not want to call it progress,
Mm-hmm.
from working with stone tools to working with computers.
Right.
Okay, so we're not denigrating anyone or calling them primitive or whatever, just by saying that there are cultures that are materially more or less developed,
Mm-hmm.
in contrast to our hyper-developed culture.
Right.
So he then made that correlation between less advanced cultures, the ones that he would have called primitive, and animism, simple belief in spirits that can be controlled by magic and by making offerings to them, bribing them, as it were. And that was the starting point of religion, and then he documented how that is found all over the world. And so that was basically his method. And a very important aspect of his method was that if a phenomenon is found under many different circumstances at many different times, then you have all the more reason to believe that a hypothesis concerning it is true than if you only find it once or twice. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
let me clarify that. Let's say you want to make a definitive study about the musical preference of duck-billed platypi or duck-billed platypuses. And so you go to Australia and find one duck-billed platypus, and you're able to converse with him like Dr. Doolittle, and you ask him, what kind of music do you like best? And he says, Mozart. And so you write an article in an important journal that states that the musical preference of duck-billed platypi is classical music, particularly the compositions of Mozart. Okay, that's very little evidence to go on.
Mm-hmm.
But if you study duck-billed platypi in different parts of the world, if they existed, and ones of different color, red, green, purple, speckled duck-billed platypi and asked all of them, which kind of music do you prefer? And they all say Mozart. Then you'd have a much stronger basis for your hypothesis that duck-billed platypi prefer classical music, particularly Mozart. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that was E.B. Tyler's logic.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have all of these so-called primitive cultures, and they all have animism for a religion.
Mm-hmm.
So the scientific scholarly world pretty much went along with him, and one of his biggest advocates and disciples was the Scottish thinker Andrew Lang.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Lang came across the the data of an Australian anthropologist named Howitt.
Mm-hmm.
And Howitt had compiled a research list that described in many Australian tribes their religion focused only on one god.
Mm-hmm.
And so Lang started to pursue that. Now, Lang did not actually work out in the field as Howitt did, but he used Howitt's data. And the more he studied it, the more he realized that those Australian tribes that were very much on the lowest level of material sophistication actually held to, okay, now for Lang, either a monotheism, they only believed in one god, or they were animists without much consciousness of a god at all.
Before you go on a little bit, in case someone doesn't know, could you explain what animism is exactly?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Animism is the belief that there are spirits everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there may be spirits in trees and plants and in lakes and so forth, dryads and so forth. There may be spirits that dwell in houses and the like. Now, spirits are not gods, so they don't have the power or knowledge that a god has, but they have certain advantages on us because they are invisible, and so they know some things that we don't, but then we also know some things that they do. And an important class of spirits are the so-called ancestor spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm saying so-called because it's really not necessary to have had descendants, direct descendants. Like if you have an unmarried uncle with no children, and when he passes away, you may still consider him one of those spirits, and we can call him an ancestor spirit, even though very technically he's not an ancestor of anyone. But so animism occupies itself with respecting the spirits, venerating them, entertaining them, informing them of things in your life or major changes in your life. Ancestor spirits never like to be surprised, and you keep them involved in the community, as it were, and usually they are venerated in some way through however many generations, still had some direct knowledge of the person, and then in most cases, as his direct memory has faded away, so he or she is considered to be gone. So, animism is spirit-directed religion. It comes from the Latin word anima, for the soul.
So then when we look at Andrew Lang, he said these cultures, they are either monotheistic, meaning they believe in one God, or they're animistic, meaning there are just many, many spirits out there, right?
Right, yeah. And now he had his opinion, namely that he could see how you could believe in one God and then fall away from that belief and turn to animism. Because if you believe in one God who doesn't need to be appeased because he already loves his creatures, and who will not do what you want him to just because you ask him to, people are impatient. They want a more direct involvement in getting the spirit world to do what you want them to, and it can turn into lucrative business.
Mm-hmm.
If you become a shaman who claims that he has a special relationship to the spirits. So Lang said, okay, we can understand how theism or monotheism can turn into animism. It's really not easy, if at all possible, to envision how an animistic culture could become monotheistic without going through all of Tyler's stages, animism to polytheism and so forth, which are definitely not found in those tribes. So Lang preferred that the theory that said monotheism came before animism, but he really did not have enough data or a good enough method at his fingers in order to prove that monotheism was younger than was older than animism.
Now, one thing we should state also is Andrew Lang wasn't a Christian, was he?
No.
Right.
He was a spiritist.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, his book, his major book, The Making of Religion, the first half or so of it is a compilation of various psychic events that he claims to have been true. And his whole point in saying that is that modern science, quote, of his day was being biased by just writing off supernatural events and supernatural realities. And so he went from there to saying, now, if science were open-minded, then they would recognize that many people, a long, long time ago actually, already believed in a single creator God. But as you said, he wasn't a Christian. He said there was remarkable similarity between the gods of the Australian Aborigines and the gods of and Jehovah of the Bible. But then he says he actually preferred the Australian Aboriginal conceptions of God rather than the God of the Bible.
Well, once again, though, it's so good to know that science has really moved on past that state where we're no longer a place where theistic ideas and such are considered out of bounds, and we're all so open-minded to these kinds of evidence. It's wonderful things have changed, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I was just thinking this morning, if leaving God and the supernatural, so-called, the spiritual world, is a prerequisite for doing, quote, natural science, as so many people say, it's a heuristic stipulation, then maybe natural science, in that sense, just isn't possible. But, it seems a strange thing to say, and I'm not asserting that dogmatically, but it certainly is getting silly at times, the way that scientists close themselves off and really live, many of them, in a totally dichotomous world where they are Christians in one part of their life and become functional atheists for all practical purposes when it comes to their science. And maybe that's good science, but it's certainly not good thinking and good knowledge.
Now, after we move past Andrew Lang, though, that gets us to Wilhelm Schmidt, doesn't it?
Yeah, more or less. Though you can't have Schmidt without having some of his predecessors in using the method that he bought into, which we're calling the cultural historical method. Now, as I said, Lang had no way of deciding which of the various cultures actually represented the least changed culture from the origin of humanity. They're, as you said, they don't come with little tags, whatever. This particular culture represents developments made 20,000 years ago or whatever. So, and this is really important in understanding Wilhelm Schmidt, that he accepted the method that was basically put together by a man named Fritz Grabner, Graebner, a German, that undertook to classify various cultures in terms of which had newer modifications, that were newer and later developments, and which seem to have been least developed and have made the least progress in their material culture, so that you could actually set up a timetable, as it were, not an absolute one, but a relative one. Now, again, Grabner was not a Christian, as far as I know. I don't know if he had any cultural Christianity, but in terms of his work, he did not believe in original monotheism. He believed that there was some kind of impersonal magic at the beginning of human culture. So I'm saying that in order to make it clear that Schmidt did not just come up with his own religious intuitions, but he was working with the same methodology as some of his colleagues in the academic world.
Now,
But
no, when you,
please.
yeah, one thing I was also thinking that we should say is that people might be thinking, well, Lang made this impact and Schmidt came along and followed it, but in reality, Lang was pretty much ignored in his time also, wasn't he?
Yeah. Some people paid attention to him enough to have generated some very interesting correspondence and a few reviews and so forth, but for the most part, Lang was not a part of the establishment. He was a writer, best known for his collections of fairy tales, and he wrote on many different subjects, and he was certainly a serious scholar, but the easiest way to deal with his conclusions was to just ignore them and to go on with whatever other speculations you might have. And besides, as I said, Lang was not able to come to a definitive conclusion about whether monotheism really was first or not, and he himself did not maintain, he continued with his beliefs along that line, but he moved on to other subjects in terms of his studies and publications. So Lang's work was not exactly a bomb dropped into the university culture of Europe, nor for that matter it was Schmidt's. Okay, so we are making the correlation that the least developed cultures now represent the cultures that have departed the least from the original culture of human beings. And that by looking at these cultures, it is possible to make a relative judgment on which culture probably, in terms of their development, was older than another culture. Or if you're looking at a geographical region, which culture may have been there first, and then the region was subsequently invaded by some other culture, and you can look for marks of these two cultures, which one was the earlier one and which one were the ones that came later.
Mm-hmm.
Now, go back to the two forks. It's not always all that hard to decide which culture was probably earlier. Now, let me, if I may, stress this point. Most people, including myself, up to a certain point, who have respect for or accept Schmidt's conclusion, have not really come to terms with his method. And more often than not, they think in terms of cumulative evidence, that there are so many tribes that have a belief in a single God, that therefore monotheism must have come earlier. Well, that doesn't really follow. I mean, that's basically E.B. Tyler's methodology, and you can count. Okay, here are so many monotheistic cultures. Here are so many animistic cultures. Now, which of which are there more, and then decide whoever has the majority somehow must be the original culture. And that's just silly. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, many critics and as well as supporters of the cultural historical method have gone that route. And that simply does not work. I mean, it's good. And, you have a book like Eternity in the Hearts by Don Richardson. You can have a lot of anecdotal evidence of monotheistic cultures and cultures that were waiting for a redeemer and so forth. But from a scholarly point of view, unless you can establish some kind of relative chronology and sort out what is and what is not good evidence, it's really not going to take you very far. It's inspirational and good, but you gotta have this method.
So one example I'm thinking of right now is that before Christianity came along, most of the world was in paganism. And then when you look at Europe, that area, say the 4th or 5th century, you'll find, it's Christian. But then you look a few centuries later, after the Muslims have shown up and they've gone through conquering, there are so many Muslim countries there, you wouldn't look and say, Islam must be the oldest religion because look at how many people are believing it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a proper analogy, or?
Proper analogy for the mistaken theory?
Yeah, I mean, it's
kind
of like saying that whatever the belief at the time, if it's so widespread, it must be the oldest one.
Yeah, and that just doesn't work. No. Let me just throw out a few trivial examples, a little bit less trivial than the fork, but just as a matter of sheer common sense. Say you have two tribes, and one has a very complex initiation rite, which involves tattooing all over the body, and the other one does not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one assumes that human beings, when they first came on the scene, did not immediately start tattooing themselves, and then later on gave up on the practice.
Okay.
Or so again, some things are just pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm.
So you have different cultures, and they have different forms. Now, by culture, I mean everything that goes beyond what you need for sheer survival.
Mm-hmm.
Or even what you are using for survival. So you have maybe one culture where the people fight each other with sticks that they broke off from trees.
Mm-hmm.
You have another culture where people take those sticks and peel them and put a point on them. And then you have a third culture, maybe in the same area, that takes those sticks and mounts sharp flint spear points on their sticks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one would assume, all other things being equal, that the first culture is the least developed.
Mm-hmm.
People did not go from spears with flint heads to just using sticks, and that consequently that culture represents an earlier culture of humanity. So that would be one so-called form. What kind of weapons do they use? what kind of pottery do they have, if they do at all?
Mm-hmm.
How do they live? Is it a mere subsistence by hunting and gathering and so forth? Or do they engage in agriculture or keep cattle and that kind of a thing? Then you have immaterial cultural forms as well. Stories, myths, and so forth that have possibly an original form and then get changed after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then you do have to count somewhere along the line. I mean, a few minutes ago we said you can't do it just by counting, but somewhere along you have to count, how widespread is a particular cultural form.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to also look at how deeply is a particular cultural form embedded in a culture.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that seems to be the focus of their existence, or is it just something that they've picked up and have added on to what originally was there?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I need to add another factor.
Okay.
That cultures move in two ways,
Mm-hmm.
at least two ways. One, people migrate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I said a while back that at this point there's a consensus building, at least, that human beings had a single origin at some time in the past. And considering the fact that there are human beings all over the globe now, they obviously migrated.
Mm-hmm.
They moved. And probably not just because they were adventurous and were getting bored with where they were, but there was a certain amount of pressure on them to move and to migrate. And chances are that the cultures with better weapons, greater ability to survive and make the best of the environment and so forth, pushed the less developed cultures out of whatever regions they may have occupied into areas that were just barely habitable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unsurprisingly, as Schmidt was applying this methodology, he found that the least developed cultures were exactly those that you expect to be in the least habitable places on Earth, and they are just barely on the brink of survival.
Uh-huh.
Or I should say were, because many of them have not survived over the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became what he called the, quote, primitive culture circles.
Mm-hmm.
The cultures that were pushed by more developed ones, and by the time that anthropologists found them, they were living in the Australian desert, in Tierra del Fuego, in the Kalahari, in various places around the North Pole in Greenland and so forth, in various places that people would not choose to live just on their own. And of course they have adapted themselves to their environment, but their culture is still a very basic hunting, gathering economy.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you look at, say, the various tribes in Australia, you can tell which are the ones that are less developed than others. And so it's not just a toss-up, as Andrew Lang was afraid it might have been, but you can separate the cultures that, say, have, as I mentioned earlier, complex initiation ceremonies, and cultures that don't have much ritual nor much magic, and don't engage in a lot of mutilation and other practices.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell which one apparently is less changed than the others. And then his conclusion was that those cultures that were on the margin, that had apparently developed least away from the most basic human culture, were also the ones that believed in a single God and worshipped him.
We're at this point in the show, a little bit past halfway point. I'd like everyone to know that this is a Deeper Waters podcast. Right now my guest is Dr. Winford Corduan, who prefers I call him Win. We're talking about his book, In the Beginning, God, The Case for Original Monotheism. But if you're here next week, I'm going to have Andy Bannister on from RZIM in Canada. We're going to be talking about a book he's come out with lately called The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. It's certainly a very amusing read, and I hope you'll be here next week when we talk about it. But for now, let's get back to Wynne talking about In the Beginning, God. Now, you said Schmidt looked at these cultures and said these cultures did believe in one high God, but did they have any evidence for that? Because a lot of people think we're saying, well, of course Schmidt's going to say that. He's a Catholic. Of course he's going to go with the monotheistic answer.
Well, yeah, and this was a thorn in his side all of his life.
Mm.
But, he had several reactions to that. A lot of times he would say, look, you're just bigoted. You haven't even read my book. You're just dismissing it or whatever. And other times he would say, well, show me where I have mishandled the evidence. Please point out to me where I am not relying on evidence but letting my Catholic prejudices, my Christian presuppositions determine the conclusion for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there is any such place. Mm-hmm. And in fact, as I said earlier, I mean, Schmidt certainly became better known than Lang, but he always came with that asterisk of, now, serious scholars are, of course, not going to accept the conclusion of a Catholic monastic priest who's just trying to make an apologetic for Christianity.
Once again, it's very good to know we've gotten past those days also of scholars being rejected because of their biases and the fear or being accused of that kind of thing. It's amazing how much has changed, isn't it?
Yes. But I don't have a persecution complex on those things.
Right.
or at least I try to avoid having one, and I don't think I do. I have to tell myself that if I am really convinced that A, there cannot be such a thing as God, or B, if there were such a thing as God, I could not live my life the way that I want to, I really wouldn't have a choice. And it wouldn't be so much a breach of integrity, but my personal integrity would tell me that I cannot accept Schmidt's conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, personally, I think that's a little dubious, and shouldn't have, that those kinds of thoughts shouldn't have much scientific standing. But what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
If you are an anthropologist working in, they say, 1930s, pursuing a lifestyle that is not compatible with a religious belief as taught in the Bible, or for that matter, other scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're just not going to, you're just intellectually not going to be able to just endorse the idea that monotheism is at the bottom of human religion and human religious culture, and they're really intertwined. So, yeah, the same kind of prejudice still exists, and it should be pointed out. But we must also realize that satire is fine, but if we want to reach the people, we also need to have a little bit of understanding of the trap that they may find themselves caught in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what I usually wind up trying to do, because it's unavoidable that we all do come with some sort of bias to these kinds of debates and such, but when I'm debating my opponents, I always try to say, okay, here's the data. If you think this isn't data, or you think I'm misreading it, show me where. Until then, don't say anything about bias at this point. And as you can see, I'm clearly trying to avoid evidence or something like that, because then bias just becomes an excuse to avoid the data.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in a footnote in his big magnum opus in the first volume,
Mm-hmm.
Schmidt quotes someone who is reporting on the discoveries of another person. Okay, so we have Schmidt quoting a source, quoting the original source.
Uh-huh.
And the source repudiates the original source simply because that person was a missionary.
Right.
And therefore not to be given credibility. And Schmidt says, this kind of nonsense has to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it hasn't stopped, but that's the data are there and the evidence is there, and so what is required of us is not to reform the academy.
Mm-hmm.
But what is required of us is to be faithful in our scholarship, to represent truth as we have been allowed to know it, to be open to critique, and change our conclusions if the evidence demands it,
and
to be faithful in that.
Yep.
and then leave it up to God and culture.
When you talked about missionaries, that could raise an objection that some people might think. They say, well, you come to these cultures and you finally believe in a high God. Well, maybe it's because people like Christians were already there, and Christians gave them the belief of a high God, and they just accepted that. I mean, how do we know that's not what happened?
Well, because it's just not possible physically and in other aspects. Let me mention here, I referred to E.V. Tyler before.
Okay.
E.V. Tyler, who taught at Oxford for a long time. He never actually finished his degree, but he became an endowed lecturer at Oxford, and he was, of course, a great advocate of the evolution of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And his most central book is probably the 2-volume Primitive Religion.
Uh-huh.
And there are 2 editions of it. In the earlier one, dated in the 1870s, he refers to the phenomenon of monotheism among Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Various people have reported that various tribes worshipped one supreme God. One very well-known example is the Algonquin worship of Manitou, or Kitching Manitou, the creator God, the good spirit. And there were a number of other examples that you can find in the book. Now, at that point in time, 1872 or so, there was no particular challenge forthcoming to Tyler on his views. And somebody had earlier criticized the idea that this could be an original monotheism by these Indian tribes, that their belief in one God undoubtedly came from contact with missionaries,
Mm-hmm.
Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that point, when Schmidt wrote his Primitive Religion, first edition, he said, no, that's just not possible. Logically, the idea that tribes 1,000 miles away incorporated a full-blown monotheism into their culture 100 years before there was any contact, just on the basis of a missionary teaching on the East Coast, and suddenly the Cheyenne in the Great Plains, by that point, start to worship Manitou and make him integral to their culture. That just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's even worse when you think of the Australian tribes, because they totally resisted the missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And would not have anything to do with them, almost to a person.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when the anthropologists finally got to know them, it turned out that they held to a monotheism, but that belief in this one God was restricted to the initiated males, and females and children didn't have knowledge of that. Now, how can that possibly come from missionaries who were preaching to both men and women, and who were just being ignored or repudiated by the tribes? So, and that was the line of reasoning that Tyler used in the first edition of his primitive religion.
Mm-hmm.
Then J.C. Howard came out with his more in-depth reports on the actual religious culture of various Australian tribes.
Mm.
Now, it's interesting that he sent those reports to the Anthropological Society in London, and Evie Tyler was president and vice president of that organization for a time, and oftentimes it was his duty to read the reports to the society.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was confronted with all of this evidence of monotheism in Native American tribes and the Australian tribes and so forth. So in the second edition of Primitive Religion, he simply made no reference to that topic. He did not talk about the possibilities of monotheism in America.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, he was no longer able to say, well, it must have been the influence. Well, he didn't say it was the influence of missionaries. He thought it was part of their development.
Mm-hmm.
So then, a while later, he came out with an article entitled "The Limits of Primitive Religion," and he used the same arguments that he had refuted before. All of a sudden, he said, well, it must have been the influence of missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And all the arguments that he had argued against, he now argued for.
Mm-hmm.
But, of course, his earlier arguments that it didn't make any logical sense, didn't make any factual sense, still stood.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to remind everyone that this is the Deeper Waters podcast, and we are a listener-supported ministry. And we could really use your support. And if you get the newsletter, for instance, you know, I'm again going to work on the Masters in New Testament at Johnston, and we could really use your fundraising there at that point. For instance, I think we need to raise $2,000 just at the start here. And if you think that's something worth pursuing, I really would hope you'd consider it. And just day-to-day expenses of keeping a ministry going and things of that sort, it's not free. And if you consider this ministry something valuable, if you like the information that you get, please consider taking part. And, you know, if you can't donate financially, donate prayerfully, be praying for us, and donate with word of mouth. Tell people about the show, about the blog, share it with others, and just see what happens. If you are someone who is able to donate to us, and I suggest you go to my blog site at deeperwaters.ddns.net. And you'll see on the left, if you go down, help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. Now there's a link in there, and that will take you to Risen Jesus Ministry, the ministry of Mike Lacona, my father-in-law. Now, you can make a donation there, and if you'd consider becoming a monthly donor, that'd be even better. And when you make that donation, you contact me through email or Facebook, or you contact Mike or Debbie and say, hey, I made a donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. They'll make sure we get it, and that ministry will be tax deductible. You can also support us through Amazon by buying books that we talk about on the show, and by buying ebooks that I have written or co-written. The one that I've written is A Creed for the Ages, a look at the Apostles' Creed. And then co-written books include Defining Inerrancy, Groundlets, Christian Answers for This Generation's Questions, and one I wrote with an atheist on God and natural disasters, a debate on that topic. And then there's also a jewelry store we got. Yes, we sell jewelry here. One of our friends of the ministry, Lena Clester, works with Premier Jewelry. And if you go to her site and you make a purchase, and then you contact her or me and say, hey, I made a purchase, I want to go to Deeper Waters, 25% of that purchase will go to us. So, I mean, guys, look at it this way. You can get your lady something very, very special, and if her love language is gifts, by the way, you've done a really good deed right there at that point. She will be thrilled with you. So you can get her something very special, and you can donate to a ministry at the same time. And friends, I really hope you will consider this. It means so much to us also to know that you consider this ministry worth supporting and donating to. I mean, I agree with Wynn. It's a thrill whenever good things come into the ministry, compliments, donations, anything whatsoever. It helps remind us why we're out there. Now, Wynn, do you have any ministry organization you'd like people to donate to?
I would like people to donate to you and Allie.
Thank
you. Are... many people understand your situation, that you have not had a solid income for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like nothing more at this point for people to do with their money, if they have any, than to support you and your wife in subsisting. You give so much of your time, and you could spend a lot more time doing different things. You could just feel sorry for yourself and be mad at God instead in difficult circumstances. You're maintaining a clear testimony for the Lord, and folks, I think that needs to be supported. So I would ask you, if you're wanting to give anything as a result of this show, please send it to the various, or by one of the methods that Nick has mentioned.
And I do thank you for that, Wynn. And I would say to people who don't know Wynn as well either, that I've been very impressed when we got to speak together at a conference in Northeast Tennessee, Northwest North Carolina area at Cherokee. You and I were together. We were never on stage together, but well, we might have been for the Q&A
Actually,
part.
for the Q&A, yeah.
Yes, but we had a wonderful time. We got to have a wonderful dinner together, and I think you were there when I gave my talk on the apologetics of love.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now, folks, you also need to know that for a time, Nick and I were playing Words with Friends, and we played maybe, 30 games, and Nick won 28 of those. Something like that.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what you want to make of that, if anything, but well, you can say this. That shows that Nick is highly intelligent. And so if you support his studies, that money's not going to go to waste. How's that?
Thank you. I really do appreciate that. And yeah, if you ever get back into playing that again, I am always open for a game.
Yeah.
Now, let's get back to Schmidt, though, with the belief in the one God. Now, when he was looking at this, I mean, how could he exactly tell that the monotheism was there and it hadn't really been changed? Because, I mean, we see cultures in the past that are polytheistic and animistic and such. I mean, maybe they just did change into monotheism from animism. How do we know it didn't go animism to monotheism instead of monotheism to animism?
Well, at this point is where I have to put the asterisk beside my statement, the method isn't rocket science. I mean, the basics of the method, I think, are pretty clear. That you look at the different cultures in a given region, and it's possible to tell which one of those has changed more than others and what their religions are and so forth. But to give it serious standing, you have to get into the details.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just deal with superficialities. And now, in some cases, you may not be able to tell. South America is a case in point. The method the historical culture or culture historical method does not yield good results for South America. Okay, and it's just not possible to establish a firm timeline of the relative ages of different cultures. So having a method to establish truth does not mean that you have omniscience.
Right.
That's something that I just keep saying in all kinds of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to speak one truth does not mean that I can speak all truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I can know some things, but I can only believe others or suspend belief about others. And so you, at that point, then you have to do as much homework as you can and look for signs that may show you that this particular culture is not as it was several hundred years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There are remnants, possibly. Okay, let me say that again. They may be remnants that show that this culture has changed dramatically. Case in point, the Lakota and some other Native Americans whose way of life changed pretty drastically with the arrival of the horse.
Right.
And so we can reconstruct by looking at forms that have persisted, that they at one time their culture was more agrarian, but they did hunt buffalo, but then when they started to find horses and tame them and use them, it became more convenient, apparently, to switch back from a more agricultural economy to a hunting culture where the bison became the focus of attention. That also meant then that the Lakota became more migratory again. I mean, if you have an agricultural economy, you're more or less going to stay in the same place. But if you're hunting, then chances are you're going to move around more. And so migration, of course, then involved encounters with other tribes which were more settled. And then we see how those tribes were affected by the influence of the Lakotas and so forth. So, to the best of one's ability, one needs to be open to the possibility that there is change, and that the movement is not always from the material less developed to the material more developed, but there can be a backwards movement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it can be like with the Lakota, the coming of the horse. It can be because of aggression by other people or because of diseases or whatever. But on the whole, there just is not evidence for a lot of regression.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as there is evidence to characterize a material culture of a certain people in a certain area, you just don't have the memories, there's a particular word that I can't think of now.
Traditions?
The residue, the residuals. Okay. I think that's
mm-hmm.
the residuals of a previously more highly developed culture.
Okay.
And yeah, as I said, omniscience is beyond our ability, but and there's another difference between us and Schmidt's culture. In his day, the humanities and social sciences were trying to emulate the natural sciences and mathematics and so forth, and trying to come up with apodictic conclusions, conclusions that maintain logical necessity, just like you can't have a round square, so your own conclusions need to be logically absolutely necessary. Well, the very natural sciences themselves wound up shooting that down with the coming of quantum mechanics and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And we're much more inclined now to think in terms of the best conclusion, the most plausible conclusion, which does not mean that there's a great amount of uncertainty, but it does mean that we're not talking about something akin to a purely logical deduction. And we can say, no, we cannot rule out that in certain instances what we're seeing now in a culture was regression. But either way, the evidence is all that we have to go on, whether it's for or against. And the evidence does not allow for a lot of regression in the cultures with which we are familiar.
Well, when we haven't got to say every argument in the book, of course, but we need to start getting down to some of the ever harder questions, and the questions more relevant to the Christian apologetics community in some ways, and that's that if we're going to assume then that the case has been made that there was an original monotheism, how do we explain that? What is the best explanation that the data shows for that?
The best explanation?
Yeah, I mean,
or the best use we can make of that?
Yeah, pretty much, what hypothesis did Schmidt put forward that would explain why all these cultures had a belief in monotheism?
Well, okay, Schmidt said, and I think this may be an answer to your question. If not, you'll need to ask it again. Now, for apologetic purposes, he said, when we look at these tribal cultures, presumably representing the oldest human cultures on Earth, we look at their belief in God and how it impacted their culture before they moved away to lesser forms of religions. And if we look at them in terms of what they say themselves of how they arrived at that belief, and how fundamental that belief was for them, it is a good hypothesis that they arrived at this conclusion because not only was the existence of God a good explanation for creation, but also God must have revealed himself to them. That we're not just talking about a God out of touch or a hypothetical God, but we're talking about a God who must have revealed himself. So halfway through his 12-volume magnum opus, Der Ursprung der Gottesidee, Schmidt says, okay, now I have finally reached my preliminary conclusion that these folks, the tribes that we're talking about, not only believed in a God, but they also claimed it came to them by revelation, and given the magnitude of the whole idea, that point is credible. So let me give you a quote there. He says, and this is my translation of Schmidt, the bottom line is that the reports we have from the adherents of the oldest religions themselves are not merely disinclined towards the supposition that the religions were created by seeking and searching human beings, rather, worse yet, they do not even mention it with a single word. Okay, so let me read to you a few more quotes by Schmidt.
Okay.
And a couple of sentences out of my book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When it came right down to it, Genesis remained authoritative for Schmidt and took precedence over paleontological discoveries, which were totally ambiguous. Concerning biblical interpretation, he felt that the biggest question that needed to be addressed was whether Genesis 1 was a historical account or merely a personal confession of the writer to his faith in God as creator, and he cut through that issue quickly. Now, to quote him, presently it will appear that the second chapter of Genesis begins and continues uninterruptedly thereafter a historical presentation of the primitive period of mankind based on original sources. Would it not be strange, then, were the first chapter alone to lack historical and documentary authority? Furthermore, the necessary connection between the first and the second narrative is so evident as to make the position that considers Genesis 1 to be unhistorical less tenable. Okay, so he believes that the original monotheism also contributes to the belief in a creator. The belief in the one creator, as I said earlier, is tied to certain ethical norms. And Schmidt makes the point, and really expands on it in his book Divine Revelation, which is available in English also. He makes the point that these cultures, as backward as they may be, materially have high moral standards. And they believe in monogamy, and as I said earlier, truth-telling, not wanton killing, respecting other people's property, sharing with each other. There is a tribe, or there was a tribe, that in the late 19th century added something to their initiation ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when adolescents were initiated into the secrets of the tribe, they added a ritual to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, these were monotheists who had high moral standards, and they had the young people, with the gesture, grab their chests as though they're pulling out something and throwing it to the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And what that signified is they were supposed to rid themselves of the selfishness that they may have learned from the white colonialists who called themselves Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, if you're thinking apologetically, monotheism provides a basis for both public and private morality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, again, if I can read from Schmidt here, something of such intense force must have come upon these most ancient beings in an encounter that became an all-encompassing, destabilizing experience, penetrating their entire being to its innermost core, so that immediately, due to its overpowering might, it gave rise to the unity and comprehensiveness that we observe in the oldest of religions.
Mm-hmm.
And then he elaborates more on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, apologetically, then, the bottom line is the oldest human cultures believed in a God who very nicely matches up in most of his attributes with the God of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we need to be careful. The same thing can be said about Allah in Islam,
Mm-hmm.
or Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. That these views of God, their views of God are very much like the biblical God.
Right.
But we need to be careful that we don't say, in terms of contemporary practice, they worship the biblical God.
Right.
And some people have been getting a little bit over enthusiastic
Mm-hmm.
with that idea,
Mm-hmm.
that they have discovered that at one point their culture worshipped one God, and so they immediately start to worshiping the God of the Bible by thinking of their national heritage God, and the worship and ritual and so forth, and that's accorded to him. And I don't think that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we can simply say that here we have tribes or cultures or whatever who bear strong testimony to the fact that God created the universe, he created human beings, and at one point they worshipped only him.
Mm-hmm.
And this God is not just an idea, but he came with moral expectations of his people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that isn't enough, I don't know how far well, let me say it another way. I just don't think that it's really possible to go further than that and say, here we have evidence for the biblical God. No, we don't. Okay. The God in various tribes has many of the same attributes, but also has a lot of secondary attributes that do not coincide with the God of Scripture, which is obviously what you would expect.
Right.
That there are cultural alterations. But I am perfectly satisfied with the idea that we can say with confidence that they all began with monotheism.
And the important thing we can get from this is that it's not that monotheism is an aberration, that's a late development, but that rather the opposite. It's animism and polytheism that are the aberration in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's very interesting that the Bible has a huge gap in the history of religions. In Genesis 11, we have the Tower of Babel, and the people are dispersed. In Genesis 12, we come to Abraham, who is called by God, and at that point, idolatry and paganism seems to have become the norm rather than the exception. So once people had alienated themselves from the true God, apparently, we can call it an aberration, but it was almost more the rule than the exception that having disowned God, they then went into the worship of idols and other things. And of course, that's exactly what Paul says in Romans 1. Even though they knew God, they did not acknowledge him and started to worship the creature rather than the creator. But the Bible never talks about that process, except there in Romans 1 maybe, but it doesn't give us any description of people who are somehow devising their own religion. It seems to be just an assumption that once the relationship with God is severed, people are going to go for misunderstandings and misrepresentations and, as I said, false religions.
Yeah, but the thing that we have to get is that somewhere back there is still that one God, and ultimately, if we were being missionaries to these cultures, it'd probably be wisest to try to appeal to that one God, like Paul did in Acts 17.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And that applies not only to the cultures that somehow have retained monotheism, but even those like the Kikuyu that I mentioned, who worship Ngai only every once in a while. It is still very much the case that you can talk to, in fact, this is what missionaries do. Missionaries to the Kikuyu, for example, they use Ngai as the name for God, because even though in the traditional culture of the first part of the 20th century, Ngai was just a sideliner to the animism taken by himself. He really had the attributes of God. He was just being ignored. The original god of China was Shangdi, who was later displaced by Tian, or heaven. But Shangdi is still used in the Chinese New Testament, where our English says Lord. The word in Chinese is Shangdi.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, okay, God is a different word. The generic word for God is Qian, but where it says Lord, they use Shangdi. So, yeah, you can use the terminology, and missionary and indigenous people oftentimes do, but still, you have to be careful not to establish a syncretism.
Well, we've had an interesting conversation today, but unfortunately we have to be wrapping things up. If people have been intrigued and they want to find out more about you and your work, do you have a blog or a website or an email or some way people can find out about you and get in touch with you?
Certainly. I am, of course, on Facebook. I have a website which you can get to just by www.wincorduan.com.
Mm-hmm.
No spaces or anything, just WINCORDUAN. I have a blog which is which I have not been faithful with for the last little while, and that is Corduan, again, just one word, lowercase, .bravejournal, brave as in a valiant warrior, bravejournal.com, and those would be the best ways of, the best channels to make contact.
Yeah.
Because my email is everywhere there, and so it's it's Facebook and the website wincorduan.com, and the journal, the blog wincorduan.bravejournal.com.
Yeah. Do you have any final message you'd like to leave for the Deeper Waters audience today?
Well, yeah, let me just say this. Never ever let us forget that whatever we do in scholarship, in our thinking, our reasoning skills, of defending the truth of Christianity, that we are simply serving the greater cause of letting people see Jesus Christ. Our calling is not to establish a Christian culture or to inflict a Christian curriculum on secular schools. Our calling is first and foremost to present Jesus Christ to a lost world. And whatever it takes, feeding people, giving them shelter, showing them love, or answering their intellectual questions, parentheses, apologetics, these are all ways of trying to present a clear picture of the gospel and give people an opportunity to respond to God's invitation. And also, what hopefully this kind of material does is to help those who are Christians understand that they can believe with confidence, that they can own up to the faith that they've been brought up with without conceding intellectual confidence.
The book, go ahead.
So I just want to say, I mean, it's great to be a part of it, but please, it's never an end in itself. It's all there to serve the fundamental cause of having people trust in Christ.
The book is called In the Beginning God, a fresh look of a case for original monotheism, and at the time of this recording, the paperback is available for $17.05 and a Kindle version for $7.99. And Wynn, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Hopefully we'll see you back here again sometime.
Thank you, Nick. It really was a pleasure.
And I'd like to remind everyone that next week we're going to have Andy Bannister on, talking about his book, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. For now, I'm Nick Peters, and I am signing off until next week.